Lang stood before the assembled officers, his written report distributed to each attendee. He'd spent 3 nights preparing the document, carefully balancing technical accuracy with political sensitivity. But ultimately, facts could not be softened beyond recognition. Gentlemen, the North American P-51 Mustang represents the most capable fighter aircraft currently operational over Europe, Lang began. This conclusion is based on comprehensive flight testing and combat simulation against our frontline fighters. He displayed performance charts comparing the Mustang to German aircraft across multiple parameters: speed, climb rate, range, ceiling, armament, and visibility in nearly every category. The American fighter equaled or exceeded German capabilities. The aircraft's most significant advantage is range, Lang continued. Equipped with external fuel tanks, the Mustang can escort bombers from England to Berlin and return a round trip of approximately 1,000 miles. Our fighters must land and refuel, while American formations continue to their targets. This single factor has fundamentally altered the strategic balance. General Major Joseph Cam Huber, responsible for home air defense, interrupted. But surely our pilots' superior training and experience provide adequate advantage? Lang chose his response carefully. Experience matters significantly in combat aviation. However, the Mustang's design minimizes pilot workload and maximizes situational awareness. A moderately skilled American pilot in a Mustang poses a serious threat to even our veteran aviators. The aircraft itself compensates for many pilot deficiencies. He detailed the Mustang's tactical flexibility. In combat, the P-51 can engage on favorable terms or refuse engagement entirely. Our fighters lack the performance to force combat against a disciplined Mustang pilot. This asymmetry is devastating. American pilots kill when circumstances favor them and escape when circumstances don't. According to memoirs published by Luftwaffe General Adolf Galland in 1954, German fighter pilots referred to the period after P-51 deployment as the beginning of the end for Luftwaffe air superiority over the Reich. Engineers from Messerschmitt raised questions about specific technical features: the laminar flow wing design, the engine installation, the cooling system arrangement. Lang addressed each query with detailed observations. The Americans had made pragmatic engineering choices, prioritizing reliability and maintenance accessibility over theoretical maximum performance. Can we develop effective countermeasures? Asked a representative from the Air Ministry. Lang had anticipated this question. Our Me-262 jet fighter possesses overwhelming speed advantage. In theory, it can engage Mustangs on favorable terms, but the jet's limited endurance, poor acceleration, and mechanical unreliability severely limit its effectiveness. We're producing jets in insufficient numbers to materially affect the battle. He paused, aware that his next statement would provoke controversy. The fundamental problem isn't technical, it's strategic and industrial. America possesses limitless production capacity, abundant resources, and secure training facilities beyond our reach. They're producing Mustangs at rates we cannot match. Even if we developed a superior fighter tomorrow, we lack the industrial capacity to produce it in decisive numbers. The room erupted in argument following Lang's assessment. Younger officers, still committed to ultimate victory, insisted that German ingenuity could counter American industrial might. Older veterans, who'd witnessed the Luftwaffe's decline from dominance to desperation, sat in grim silence. Oberstbauer restored order, directing attention to practical recommendations. Lang had prepared a section addressing tactical adaptations that might improve German pilots' survival rates against Mustang escorts. First, we must abandon the practice of head-on attacks against bomber formations, Lang advised. Mustang escorts position themselves to intercept such approaches. Our fighters sustain catastrophic losses before reaching the bombers. He recommended coordinated attacks from multiple directions, forcing Mustang escorts to divide their attention. American fighters excel in one-on-one combat, but they can be overwhelmed by simultaneous threats from multiple vectors. This requires discipline and communication qualities increasingly rare as we lose experienced pilots. Lang also suggested altitude tactics. The Mustang performs exceptionally at high altitude, but it isn't invincible. Attacks from extreme altitude 35,000 feet or higher offer brief windows of opportunity before Mustang escorts can climb to intercept. Similarly, drawing American fighters down to low altitude, where our FW-190 maintains advantages, can create favorable engagements. These suggestions, while tactically sound, represented desperate measures. Germany no longer fought for victory, but for survival, seeking merely to impose maximum cost on Allied advances. General Lieutenant Adolf Galland, commander of Germany's fighter forces, attended the final day of briefings. Galland was a legendary pilot, having flown combat missions in Spain in 1937. His opinion carried tremendous weight throughout the Luftwaffe. After reviewing Lang's report and observing film from the test flights, Galland requested a private conversation. The two pilots walked through the airfield as late summer sun painted long shadows across captured aircraft from both sides of the conflict. "Your assessment is accurate, but devastating," Galland said quietly. "The P-51 has ended our ability to defend German airspace effectively." Lang remained silent, allowing the senior officer to continue. "I've fought in this war since it began," Galland reflected. "I've seen our fighter force evolve from triumph to desperation. When I flew over England in 1940, we believed ourselves invincible. Now, our pilots survive an average of 6 combat sorties before death or serious injury." He gestured toward the silver Mustang in its heavily guarded hangar. "That aircraft represents more than superior engineering. It demonstrates an industrial system we cannot defeat. America produces one Mustang every hour, over 15,000 built so far, with thousands more coming. We've lost the production war long before losing the shooting war." Galland had already reached conclusions similar to Lang's assessment. In meetings with Hitler and other Nazi leadership, he'd argued for radical changes in fighter design and production priorities. These recommendations were largely ignored or overruled by leaders divorced from operational realities. "What happens now?" Lang asked. "Your report will be filed, classified, and ultimately forgotten," Galland predicted grimly. "The leadership refuses to accept uncomfortable truths. They'll continue demanding miracle weapons and impossible victories while our pilots die in unequal combat." The prophecy proved accurate. Lang's detailed evaluation was distributed to senior commanders, but generated no substantive policy changes. Germany continued building fighters based on outdated designs, while America's Mustang fleet grew exponentially. In September 1944, Lang returned to operational duties, flying Me-262 jets against Allied bombers. He survived until war's end, accumulating additional kills, but witnessing the systematic destruction of the Luftwaffe. Meanwhile, across the English Channel, American pilots remained largely unaware of the detailed German evaluation of their fighter. They knew the P-51 Mustang was good, survival rates proved it, but few understood precisely why the aircraft provided such significant advantages. Lieutenant Robert Johnson of the 356th Fighter Group had transitioned to Mustangs in May 1944 after flying P-47 Thunderbolts. The change transformed his combat experience. The Thunderbolt was a tank heavily armored, survivable, but limited in range. Johnson recalled in post-war interviews, "The Mustang felt like a sports car, responsive and fast with legs that took us anywhere." On August 30th, Johnson's squadron escorted B-17 bombers to Stuttgart. German fighters rose to intercept, including experienced pilots from Jagdgeschwader 3. The engagement that followed demonstrated precisely the tactical dynamics Lang had described in his report. Johnson spotted Messerschmitt Bf-109's positioning for beam attacks against the bomber formation. He led his flight down from altitude, accelerating rapidly. The German fighters, focused on the bombers, failed to notice the Mustang's approach until too late. "I closed to 300 yards before firing," Johnson reported. "The 109 tried to turn away, but I had too much speed advantage. My 50 calibers walked right through his wing root. He rolled inverted and went down burning." His wingman, Lieutenant James Brooks, engaged a second 109 and attempted to dive away. "He couldn't shake me," Brooks remembered. "I followed him down from 20,000 feet to the deck. My Mustang actually gained on him in the dive. When he tried to turn, I was right there. 3-second burst, and he was done." The engagement lasted 12 minutes. American pilots claimed 6 German fighters destroyed against no losses. More importantly, the bombers completed their mission without significant interference, exactly the outcome the Mustang was designed to achieve. Colonel Donald Blakesley, commander of the 4th Fighter Group, understood the Mustang's strategic impact intuitively. "We're not here to dogfight," he reminded his pilots repeatedly. "We're here to protect the bombers and kill anyone who threatens them. The Mustang lets us do both better than anything else in the sky." Blakesley's tactical philosophy aligned perfectly with Lang's technical assessment. The Mustang excelled at dictating engagement terms, maintaining energy advantage, and refusing unfavorable combat. American pilots who embraced these principles survived and prospered. Those who sought glory in turning dogfights often died. Intelligence reports occasionally revealed German perspectives on the Mustang. Interrogations of captured Luftwaffe pilots consistently emphasized respect bordering on fear. When we saw Mustangs, we knew the mission was over. One prisoner confessed. They were faster, they could outclimb us, and they could follow us anywhere. Our only option was to run. By October 1944, P-51 Mustangs dominated European skies. Luftwaffe fighter units, depleted by casualties and fuel shortages, rarely challenged American formations effectively. German pilots increasingly avoided combat, husbanding their diminishing resources for desperate defensive missions. Major Thomas Hayes, an intelligence officer assigned to 8th Air Force Headquarters, compiled reports from bomber crews throughout autumn 1944. Fighter escort efficiency improved dramatically after Mustang deployment. His analysis concluded bomber losses declined by approximately 40%, while fighter-to-fighter kill ratios favored American pilots by margins exceeding 5-1. The captured Mustang remained at Rechlin Evaluation Center until April 1945, when advancing Soviet forces forced German personnel to abandon the facility. The aircraft was deliberately destroyed to prevent recapture. Its wreckage scattered across the airfield during the facility's evacuation. Werner Lang's detailed report survived the war, discovered by American intelligence officers examining captured Luftwaffe documents. The assessment impressed American analysts, who recognized Lang's objectivity and technical competence. His evaluation confirmed what American designers and pilots already believed. The P-51 Mustang represented a watershed moment in fighter aircraft development. In post-war years, aviation historians and former pilots from both sides recognized the Mustang's significance. The aircraft combined sufficient performance in every relevant category to dominate its operational environment. It wasn't the fastest fighter. The German Me-262 exceeded it by nearly 100 miles per hour. It wasn't the most maneuverable. Several fighters could outturn it, but it combined range, speed, altitude performance, firepower, and visibility in proportions that proved devastatingly effective. Friedrich Lang survived the war and returned to civilian life, never publicly discussing his role in evaluating captured Allied aircraft. He passed away in 1978. His contributions to aviation history largely forgotten outside specialist circles. His report, declassified in the 1970s, became a valuable resource for historians studying wartime aircraft development. Adolf Galland, who predicted the report's irrelevance to German leadership, testified at post-war hearings about Luftwaffe operations. The P-51's appearance over Germany marked the beginning of our end. He stated plainly, we could no longer defend our cities, our factories, or our people. Air superiority passed permanently to the Allies. By war's end, North American aviation had produced more than 15,000 P-51 Mustangs in various configurations. The aircraft served with distinction in every theater of conflict. From Europe to the Pacific, post-war, many nations adopted the Mustang for their air forces, testament to its enduring design excellence. The phrase "can't be shot down," attributed to various German pilots who encountered the Mustang, reflected frustrated hyperbole rather than literal assessment. Mustangs were shot down, hundreds were lost in combat, but the aircraft's combination of capabilities made it exceptionally difficult to engage effectively, particularly when flown by competent pilots employing sound tactics. Lang's evaluation emphasized this crucial point. The Mustang wasn't invincible, but it tilted probability decisively in its pilot's favor. In aerial combat, where margins between life and death measured in split seconds and fractional advantages, this edge proved decisive. Modern analysis of World War II aerial combat consistently confirms Lang's assessment. The P-51 Mustang achieved kill ratios exceeding 10-1 against German fighters. In the war's final year, these statistics reflected not just aircraft performance, but the intersection of design excellence, pilot training, tactical employment, and industrial capacity. The captured Mustang that Friedrich Lang flew during those August days in 1944 represented more than a technological artifact. It symbolized the moment when German aviation leadership confronted irrefutable evidence of their strategic defeat. Lang's professional, objective evaluation stripped away propaganda and wishful thinking, revealing uncomfortable truths that German leadership refused to acknowledge until too late. In the end, the story of the German pilot who tested the captured P-51 Mustang and declared it nearly impossible to defeat wasn't about one aircraft or one pilot. It was about the collision between exceptional engineering in desperate circumstances, between objective assessment and ideological denial, between individual competence and systemic failure. Lang's report documented not just an aircraft's capabilities, but the beginning of the end. For German air power, a conclusion as inevitable as it was tragic for those who fought, flew, and died in Europe's contested skies during those final, desperate months of World War II.
Choice, back Wallace and lose Burns, and the support of most foreign policy experts, or fire Wallace and face a revolt from the progressive wing of the Democratic Party. The decision took 8 days. During that time, Wallace gave another speech doubling down on his positions. He met with Truman on September 18th and refused to promise silence on foreign policy matters. The Commerce Secretary believed deeply in his position, convinced that Truman was leading America toward unnecessary conflict with the Soviet Union. He would not be muzzled, even by the president. On September 20th, 1946, Truman called Wallace to his office and requested his resignation. Wallace initially resisted, then capitulated. The dismissal was announced that evening, sending shockwaves through the political establishment. Truman had fired a man who still commanded significant loyalty among liberals, labor unions, and African American voters. Wallace had been Roosevelt's chosen vice president from 1940 to 1944, a symbol of the New Deal's progressive wing. His removal marked the definitive end of Roosevelt's coalition. The political fallout was severe but manageable. Progressive Democrats were furious, with some predicting Truman would lose the 1948 election as punishment. Wallace himself would eventually run against Truman on a third-party progressive ticket in 1948, though he would win less than 3% of the vote. Labor leaders grumbled but mostly stayed loyal. African American leaders were disappointed, but had nowhere else to go politically. For Truman, the Wallace firing was liberating. He had removed the last major figure from Roosevelt's inner circle who actively opposed his policies. The cabinet was now entirely his own. More importantly, the dismissal established Truman's absolute control over his administration's message. There would be no more freelancing, no more public dissent from cabinet members, no more appeals to Roosevelt's memory as justification for opposing presidential decisions. By the end of September 1946, just 18 months after taking office, Harry Truman had completed the most thorough remake of a presidential administration in modern American history. Nearly every cabinet position had turned over. Scores of sub-cabinet officials had been replaced. The entire tone and direction of government had shifted. Winter 1946 stretched into spring 1947, and with each passing month, the transformation of American foreign policy became more pronounced. Harry Truman, now governing with a cabinet entirely of his own choosing, began articulating a vision that would have been unthinkable during Franklin Roosevelt's presidency. The wartime alliance with the Soviet Union was dead. In its place, Truman was constructing a policy of containment, of active resistance to Soviet expansion, that would define American foreign policy for the next 4 decades. The catalyst came from an unlikely source: Great Britain's economic exhaustion. On February 21, 1947, the British government informed the State Department that it could no longer afford to support the Greek government in its civil war against communist insurgents. Britain was also withdrawing financial and military support from Turkey, which faced Soviet pressure to grant Moscow control over the Dardanelles Straits. Without American intervention, both countries would likely fall into the Soviet sphere of influence. Secretary of State George Marshall, who had replaced Burns in January 1947, brought the crisis to Truman's attention immediately. Marshall was a strategic thinker, the architect of Allied victory in World War II, but he was also cautious about committing American resources abroad. Dean Acheson, the Undersecretary of State and a Truman loyalist, argued forcefully for intervention. If Greece and Turkey fell, he warned, Soviet influence would spread throughout the Mediterranean, threatening Italy, France, and eventually Western Europe. This was the moment when Truman's new team proved its worth. There were no voices in the cabinet arguing for accommodation with Moscow, no one suggesting that Soviet concerns about security deserved consideration. The Roosevelt era, belief in post-war cooperation with Stalin was gone, replaced by hard-headed realism about Soviet intentions. The debate was not whether to act, but how aggressively and with what resources. Truman called congressional leaders to the White House on February 27, 1947. He needed appropriations to support Greece and Turkey, which meant convincing a Republican-controlled Congress to fund what amounted to a dramatic expansion of American commitments abroad. The president laid out the stakes bluntly. Soviet totalitarianism was spreading. Free peoples everywhere needed American support. The choice was between action and appeasement, between defending democracy and watching it crumble. Senator Vandenberg, the Republican who had criticized Truman over the Wallace affair, listened carefully. When the president finished, Vandenberg offered his support, but with a condition. Truman needed to make the case to the American people directly, in the starkest possible terms. "If you will say that to the country," Vandenberg told the president, "I will support you, and I believe most of Congress will do the same." On March 12, 1947, Harry Truman addressed a joint session of Congress and delivered what would become known as the Truman Doctrine. Speaking in clear, uncompromising language, the president declared that it must be the policy of the United States to support free peoples resisting subjugation by armed minorities or outside pressures. He requested for $100 million in aid for Greece and Turkey. More importantly, he committed America to global leadership in resisting communist expansion. The speech marked a turning point in American history. For 150 years, the United States had generally avoided permanent foreign entanglements. Even Roosevelt, for all his internationalism, had conceived of the post-war order as managed by a handful of great powers cooperating through the United Nations. Truman was proposing something entirely different, a global American commitment to containing Soviet power wherever it might emerge. Could Roosevelt have delivered such a speech? The question fascinated historians and political observers. Roosevelt had trusted Stalin personally, had believed in the possibility of managing Soviet behavior through diplomatic engagement. He had resisted Churchill's warnings about Soviet intentions in Eastern Europe. It seemed unlikely that Roosevelt, had he lived, would have embraced Truman's confrontational approach so quickly or so completely. But Roosevelt was gone, and his appointees were gone with him. The government Harry Truman now commanded was built to execute his vision, not preserve his predecessor's legacy. Secretary of State Marshall would implement the Truman Doctrine with military precision. Under-Secretary Acheson would provide the intellectual framework for containment policy. Secretary of Defense James Forrestal, who had replaced Patterson in September 1947 in the newly reorganized Defense Department, would build the military capacity to support global commitments. The Truman Doctrine passed Congress with bipartisan support. American aid began flowing to Greece and Turkey. The Greek government, backed by American money and advisors, gradually defeated the communist insurgency. Turkey resisted Soviet pressure and remained independent. The pattern was established. Where communist expansion threatened, American power would respond. Truman's remake of Roosevelt's government was complete, and with it came a complete remake of American foreign policy. Summer 1947 brought Secretary of State George Marshall to Harvard University, where on June 5 he delivered a commencement address that would reshape the post-war world. The Marshall Plan, as it became known, proposed massive American economic aid to rebuild Europe, including potentially the western zones of occupied Germany. The scale was breathtaking, over $13 billion over 4 years, equivalent to roughly $150 billion in modern currency. No nation in history had ever attempted foreign aid on such a magnitude. The Marshall Plan was vintage Truman administration thinking, and it would have been impossible under Roosevelt's team. Henry Morgenthau's punitive approach to Germany was dead, replaced by the recognition that European prosperity served American security interests. Henry Wallace's faith in Soviet cooperation was gone, replaced by the understanding that economic recovery was the best defense against communist subversion. The plan offered aid to all European nations, including the Soviet Union and its satellites, but with conditions Moscow would never accept: transparency, cooperation with Western nations, and integration into a market-based economic system. As expected, Stalin rejected the Marshall Plan and forbade Eastern European nations from participating. Czechoslovakia's initial interest in accepting aid was crushed by Soviet pressure. The division of Europe was complete, and it had happened on Truman's watch. Under Truman's leadership, with Truman's appointees executing the strategy. The contrast with Roosevelt's vision of post-war cooperation could not have been starker. The implementation of the Marshall Plan required unprecedented bureaucratic capacity. The Economic Cooperation Administration was created to manage the aid program, headed by Paul Hoffman, a successful businessman whom Truman trusted. The State Department expanded dramatically to handle the diplomatic complexities. The Treasury Department, now under John Snyder, a Missouri banker and Truman friends since their Army service in World War I, managed the financial mechanisms. Every key position was filled by someone loyal to Truman, someone committed to his vision of an activist American foreign policy. By late 1947, the transformation Truman had begun in April 1945 was essentially complete. Of Roosevelt's original cabinet, not a single member remained. Henry Stimson had retired. Morgenthau had been pushed out. Francis Perkins was gone. Frank Walker, the Postmaster General, had left. Harold Ickes, the crusty Interior Secretary who had served Roosevelt since 1933, had resigned in February 1946 after clashing with Truman over oil policy. Even James Forrestal, though he remained in government, had moved from Navy Secretary to the new position of Defense Secretary, fundamentally changing his role. The sub-cabinet level had seen even more dramatic turnover. Dean Acheson, George Kennan, Clark Clifford, Charles Bolin, Robert Lovett, these were the men shaping American policy now, and they were all Truman's people. Kennan, serving as head of the State Department's policy planning staff, had articulated the intellectual framework for containment in his famous long telegram from Moscow. Clifford, as White House counsel, had helped craft the Truman Doctrine speech. Bolin had translated at Yalta for Roosevelt, but now served Truman's very different approach to Soviet relations. The personnel transformation had enabled a policy transformation. Truman's government was built to confront the Soviet Union, to lead a global alliance of democratic nations, to use American economic and military power actively in world affairs. Roosevelt's government, for all its wartime effectiveness, had been built on different assumptions: that the United Nations would manage international security, that the great powers would cooperate, that American troops would come home and America would return to something approaching its traditional hemispheric focus. The political consequences of Truman's choices remained uncertain. As 1947 drew to a close, Democrats had lost control of Congress in the 1946 midterm elections, in part because of domestic policy failures and labor unrest. Truman's approval ratings were mediocre. Most political observers assumed he would lose the presidency in 1948, either to a Republican challenger or through a Democratic Party revolt that would deny him renomination. Henry Wallace was already preparing his third-party campaign, arguing that Truman had betrayed Roosevelt's legacy and unnecessarily antagonized the Soviet Union. Yet Truman's remake of the government had given him something Roosevelt's team never could have provided: a coherent strategy for the post-war world, and a team capable of executing it. The Truman Doctrine and Marshall Plan were not merely policy initiatives. They were the foundation of a new international order with America at its center. Whether this strategy would succeed remained to be seen, but there was no doubt that it was Truman's strategy, implemented by Truman's people. For better or worse, January 1949 marked the beginning of Harry Truman's second term, a term most observers had believed impossible. The president had defied political gravity, defeating Republican Thomas Dewey in the 1948 election, despite facing opposition from both Wallace's Progressive Party on the left and Strom Thurmond's segregationist Dixiecrat revolt on the right. Truman had won by campaigning as himself, not as Roosevelt's successor. His famous whistle-stop tour of America had featured attacks on the Republican Congress, promises of civil rights reform, and defense of his foreign policy achievements. By this point, nearly 4 years after Roosevelt's death, the personnel transformation was ancient history. No one seriously discussed returning to Roosevelt-era approaches to governance or foreign policy. The world had changed dramatically, and Truman's appointees had proven too effective. Dean Acheson succeeded Marshall as Secretary of State in January 1949 and would oversee the creation of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. the mutual defense alliance that institutionalized Western resistance to Soviet expansion. The Korean War, which began in June 1950, would be fought under Truman's leadership, with Truman's team managing the crisis. The question historians would debate for decades was whether Truman's wholesale replacement of Roosevelt's team had been necessary, wise, or both. Critics argued that Truman had been too quick to dismiss experienced hands, too eager to surround himself with mediocre yes-men from Missouri and the Senate. They pointed to figures like Henry Morgenthau, whose economic expertise exceeded Fred Vinson's, or Henry Wallace, whose progressive vision had animated the New Deal's most ambitious programs. Had Truman been more patient, more inclusive, might he have governed more effectively? Defenders of Truman's approach countered that the personnel transformation had been essential for several reasons. First, Roosevelt's appointees owed their loyalty to a dead president and to policies that were increasing obsolete. Second, many of them, particularly Wallace, held views on Soviet relations that were dangerously naive, given Moscow's behavior in Eastern Europe. Third, Truman needed to establish his own authority and could not do so while governing in Roosevelt's shadow. The purge, though dramatic, had been politically necessary and strategically justified. The historical record tends to support Truman's defenders. The policies implemented by his administration: containment, the Marshall Plan, NATO, the Berlin airlift, support for European integration proved remarkably durable and successful. The Soviet Union was contained. Western Europe recovered and prospered. The democratic nations weathered the Cold War and eventually emerged victorious. Whether Roosevelt's team could have achieved the same results is unknowable, but it seems unlikely given their fundamentally different worldview. Moreover, Truman's personnel choices reflected a deeper truth about presidential leadership. Effectiveness requires loyalty and alignment between a president's vision and his team's execution. Roosevelt's appointees, no matter how talented, were fundamentally committed to Roosevelt's vision of the post-war world. When that vision proved incompatible with emerging realities, the appointees became obstacles rather than assets. Truman's willingness to make wholesale changes, despite political costs, demonstrated the kind of decisive leadership the post-war moment required. The 18-month timeframe of Truman's purge also deserves attention. It was neither so rapid as to appear reckless nor so slow as to suggest indecision. Truman moved methodically, replacing Roosevelt's team as circumstances demanded and opportunities arose. Stimson left when he was ready to retire. Morgenthau was pushed out when he became a clear obstacle. Wallace was fired when his public dissent became intolerable. The pace reflected strategic thinking rather than impulsiveness. Finally, Truman's choices revealed something important about democratic governance in crisis moments: the peaceful transition of power from Roosevelt to Truman, despite the dramatic policy shifts it enabled, demonstrated American constitutional resilience. There was no requirement that Truman maintain Roosevelt's team or preserve Roosevelt's policies. Elections and constitutional processes had made Truman president, and the presidency carried with it the authority to govern according to one's own judgment. The purge was controversial but legitimate, dramatic but democratic. By the time Truman left office in January 1953, his place in history was secure. The man who had seemed so unprepared in April 1945 had led America through the most dangerous period in its history. He had made the decision to use atomic weapons, had articulated the Truman Doctrine, had implemented the Marshall Plan, had created NATO, had fought the Korean War to a stalemate that preserved South Korean independence. These achievements rested on the foundation of his wholesale remake of Roosevelt's government in those critical first 18 months. Today, the Truman presidency is generally regarded as successful, even great. His decision to systematically replace Roosevelt's appointees with his own team is seen not as petty political revenge, but as necessary statecraft. The purge was not personal, but presidential. The assertion of executive authority required to meet unprecedented challenges. Harry Truman, the accidental president, had proven that sometimes the greatest gift a leader can give his country is the courage to step out from his predecessor's shadow and govern according to his own convictions, regardless of political cost or historical sentiment.